In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can build a 2.5D puppet inside of Maya using the artwork that we took a look at inside of Photoshop, and then building out a special type of geometry that we can kind of chop up, put a skeleton inside of this thing, and then be able to get animation on this and then push that out to a game engine like Unreal Engine 4. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at the different pieces that we're going to need to create for this. Alright, the first thing we're going to look at is actually how to create our geometry that we see inside of the program, so we can actually get this thing kind of set up like the way that we see here. I want you to take a look at the art that was created again for this inside of Photoshop. So the end goal was to get everything on a texture page that this thing is. If I hold down Alt and then click right in here, I can see the width and the height is 1497 by 1497. So I think the final image for this was put into a better power of 2. If I go ahead and open this thing up and take a look at the PNG file for this, and I take this and open this one up, this was the final file that we have here for this thing. So the size of this is 1024 by 1024. This just happens to be the size that was made for creating the art. So you can see here's the kind of resolution that was used to paint the thing. But we need to get this into a game engine and have it be certain powers of 2. You can see here, if I hold down Alt and click on there, this one's 1024 by 1024. The next size up would be 2048 by 2048. And if you wanted to drop it lower than this, you can go half of this, so it's 512 by 512. So it's pretty easy to get that image into the right image size. So you can just go to image size, and you would be able to change the dimensions on this. This is Photoshop Creative Cloud, and so it's a little bit different than the earlier version of Photoshop, but if you want to resample the image and change the image size, you just click this little thing here. We can put this on pixels, and if I wanted to put this at 512 by 512, you can see it's going to constrain the aspect ratio based off of this thing here. So I can go ahead and hit OK for that, and you can see pretty easily I could change the size of that. I'm not actually going to save it, just want to show you kind of that's the process for actually getting this thing out. A little bit more about this. So I have to kind of think about this thing as a puppet and the different pieces that I need. So we need the body to be kind of separate. That's going to be deformed along the tail with a, with bones that we're going to be setting up. But we have to set up the legs and everything else in kind of a way to where, we can put these pivot points in there with joints and then start to animate these things. So everything has to be kind of separated out into its own island. So there are these own kind of floating pieces. And so that's why it kind of looks the way that it does. I do have a little bit more room for maybe some different facial expressions and things like that. So I do have some room to play with on this texture page, maybe at a later time. So that's how that file was spit out. The file format, if you're going to save this thing, and if you save it as a target file, you're going to want to make sure that you include the alpha channel for this. So if we put it on Targa, you're going to want to include the alpha channel like that. And if I go ahead and hit save, you can see it's going to bring up a dialog box that you're going to want to make sure it's in 32 bits. That's going to actually hold an alpha channel for you, and you would actually need to make sure that you have in your channels an alpha channel that's set up for this. So you can see my alpha channel no longer matches the exact transparency that I had of the image. That's pretty simple to fix. So any of the pieces that you see here, I can hold down Control and then click on this and hold down Control and Shift and keep adding to these selections of transparency of the layers like this. I'll just keep going through and select everything that's on the page. So we got our body. Looks like I maybe missed this back arm and the tongue. There we go. And I could turn on this background thing that I have on there. I made the background a very similar color to this outline that you see here, so we don't get any kind of weird white bleeding in the game engine. And then from channels, I can just, with that selection made, I can just click this make save selection to a new channel, and you can see it's going to actually save that thing out like what we see here. It's gonna hit Control D to deselect this. So I really don't need this old channel anymore. I'll just get rid of that thing. And you might want to go through and just check and make sure. You might have to do a little bit of cleanup. You can see I kind of missed a little part right there. So I'm gonna go ahead and just paint these sections out right there with the black like that. And then I would be able to save this thing out. I'm going to just turn off the background. I'm going to save the file and then close it up. But that's how you'd save it as a Targa. If you wanted to save it as a PNG, you could do that as well. So you can do save as, do PNG, and then come right down here like this, and then save it out. That one's going to save it out, and it's going to have the transparency like embedded directly within the file itself, so you don't have to kind of do anything with the alpha channel. And Unreal Engine 4 handles these PNG files pretty well, so it's just something to consider. I've always used Targa files, but it does seem like PNG works out pretty good as well. So that's how we get our different files saved out for the images. Let's take a look at how we can actually bring those images into Maya now. Alright, so the end goal is to create something like this that we see here inside of Maya. So we've got geometry that contains our different pixels that we created inside of Photoshop, and it contains enough geometry to give it enough buffer space where we have this transparency, and then it's built up in these kind of this layering system to give the illusion of depth, right? So let's go ahead and get this thing moving forward for this. So this is the characters. It's just selected here. I'm going to deselect that, and I'm going to take the animation controls for it and the IK that it has on there, and just move this stuff off to the side a little bit for this thing right now. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a polygon primitive, and we're going to use a polygon plane. So I'm going to go create polygon primitive, and then I'm going to use plane. We can do the option box for this thing, and we can just maybe set this up. Let's see what these numbers kind of equal out to. I'll do a width and a height of 10 like this, and width and height divisions of 1. And we'll do this axis on Y, and it should make a plane down here for us on the grid that you see here. If you don't see your grid, you can turn on and off the grid like this here. If you want to see the settings that I have for my grid, we can go to Display, Grid, and go to the option box for that. And these are some of the options that I set for the size of the grid here for what I've got going on. So that plane is pretty small. We could take it and we could scale the thing up if we wanted, right through here like that, and we could change the numbers over in the channel box. So I don't know, we could just make this a number like 20 or something like that. This seems to be okay for that right now. And if we want to take this and kind of freeze all these numbers, we can do this. We can go to modify freeze transformations, and I'll do the option box and make sure we have translation, rotation, and scale on. We can do that, and you can see it's going to freeze that. I probably want to delete history too, so get used to doing Alt-Shift-D to delete your history. Sometimes that can cause issues. The other thing is maybe I want to take this and rotate this thing up, so I'm going to use the rotate tool, and I'm just going to grab this axis here and then rotate it up. And you can see I need to rotate it, looks like -90, so I'll just type in -90 there, and then we can freeze the transformations again like that. And the other thing, if I wanted to push this up, we could put it on the translate tool that we have here, and I could hold down X and temporarily turn on snapping to the grid. And so you can see if I snap that up like that, it's going to push it up 100 units, and then I could freeze the transformations one last time. Looks like I still need to get this character out of the way, so I'm just going to move him back this way just a little bit more and turn off the layer that I have for the animation controls on this thing. And it looks like something's going on with the leg, but I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. So we've got this plane. we got everything kind of set up for this thing. The next part is making sure we get an image on here with a shader. So we're going to go to Windows and then go to the rendering editors and go to the Hypershade and open that up. And you can see here we've got these different tabs for different materials and textures, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and take you through this process of getting that image in there. So over here in the Maya tab, we can go to 2D textures and there's a file texture node. So you can just click on it and it should make a new file node for you. And you could name this something. I'm just going to call this Dino Class Test, something like that. And I'll come down here to this area that you click on this little folder icon and it's going to let you navigate to where that thing sits. And again, I had under this area I have target files or a PNG. I'll just use the PNG file. So I'll go ahead and load that up. I'll go ahead and hit open for that. And so then now we've got our new texture file. I'm going to clear this graph down here so we don't see anything and just kind of start fresh and new. And I can middle mouse drag this down into this area and you can see that we have all the information associated with this texture file right now like this. The other thing I'll do is just create a material that's a Lambert material. So we're just going to go to this area up here and open the surface area up and just make a Lambert material. And you can see it's going to throw this thing over in here like this. We can select it. And if we go to the material section, you should see this new Lambert material that you got. So you can either select it here or here. Doesn't really matter. And now we can call this Dino Class Test. Something like that. And I think I missed this thing here. No big deal. And maybe I'll put at the front of it, I've seen in Unreal Engine 4 they like to put M underscore for material. No big deal for that, but just if you want to do that to keep things kind of straight. So there's different ways that you can kind of hook things up. If you have the material selected here, you can take the texture node, you can middle mouse drag it over to the color, and that'll hook that thing up. That's one way of doing it. Or you can take this connection, you can just select it and break it. That's one way of doing it. And we also have our textures over here. So if we select this thing, you could middle mouse drag the texture. Let me grab that again and just drag it onto the color. That's another way that you could do that. But you can see we've got this thing, so we need to start worrying about transparency. So transparency is pretty easy to hook up. We could just take this node here. We could middle mouse drag it over the word transparency right in here, and I believe that would hook it up. You can hit undo for that real quick, and we could also go back to our texture that we kind of looked at and middle mouse drag that over transparency. It just picks up the alpha and it knows to go ahead and knock that thing out based off of the alpha that we have. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got in the world here. So it appears that this thing is not orientated the correct way. So I'm going to go open up the UV texture window and just check and see what's going on with the UVs on this. So if we go to Windows and then we go to UV editor, we can take a look at what is currently set up for the UVs on this thing. And so we've got this image and it looks like everything is sorry about that. Let's go back to perspective. Looks like everything is set up correctly this way. It's just, because it didn't have an image on there, it didn't really know exactly how this thing was rotated. So that's pretty simple to fix. We can just put that on a rotate tool and rotate this thing back about 90 degrees. Now there is a hotkey for rotating. If we hold down J while we rotate with this thing, it'll snap into different degree increments. So then that way we wouldn't have to go over here to the channel box and put in 90 degrees, but it's there. Either way you want to do it. So again, I'm going to go to modify, freeze transformations, and zero everything out. And so now we're at the stage where we've got our card kind of set up, we've got our transparency working, and now we need to start splitting this model apart into these different pieces. So if you have your model selected in object mode, you can right click over it and just make sure you're in object mode. You can see everything should select as this green kind of color that you see here. we'll be able to hold down Shift and then right click over this and then use the multi-cut tool that they have inside of Maya. So let's put it on that. This one's pretty easy to use. You can just kind of click and drag off an edge like this, and then you can start drawing points out anywhere on the model that you see here. So I'm just going to kind of go through and do some very simple stuff to get this thing split apart, and then maybe finesse it a little bit more later. So after you have something drawn out, you can hit enter like this, and then it will finish out that tool. I am going to select this. I'm just having a little bit of trouble focusing the camera on this thing, so I need to highlight something and then tap F, and I can frame it on that thing, and now whenever I rotate around that point, it's going to be a little bit easier for me. So we can go back to that multi-cut tool again. The way that you can get to it, there's different ways. We do have the modeling toolkit area, which they do have the multi-cut tool in there, or you could go into your object mode. I'm going to hit F8, that's the hotkey for that, and then hold on Shift and right click and say multi-cut tool. So there's different ways to get there. It's up to you how you kind of want to get to that tool. So I'm just going to keep continuing to work my way around this area like this. I'm just going to take a chunk off of this right now just so I can show you how to kind of get this thing separated out. So after we have some pieces made, I'm going to put it on the selection tool, and we could just right click on here and say face. I just want to select this face that you see here, and I can go ahead and hit backspace and get rid of that. So I'm kind of deleting out those chunks that we see here. The other thing is now we've got these vertices that are connected here like this. Let me tap B. There was some soft selection thing on. So I can click and move this thing around. You can see how it kind of affects this. So how are we going to get these things pulled apart? Well, we could split and make a really tiny split going through there. That's one option. The other thing that we could do is select these verts through here and then go up here to Edit Mesh, and then there's a detach component there. Now when we do that, actually we might need to do edges, so I'm going to hit F10, or you can right click on here and say edge, and let's select these, and then let's try this and go Edit Mesh and then detach like this, and see if that's going to kind of separate those things that you see here. At least this piece and this piece are now separated. Now the next step would be, after you have this thing and you hit F8 or you right click and say object mode, you can still select it and you can still see it's still this one polyplane. But after we've kind of gone through and separated everything, you should be able to go to mesh, and then there is an actual separate command. So after we do that, it's going to make a layer group, actually a group here in the outliner, and it's going to bust those into different pieces. There is going to be this weird kind of transform thing left over, so you're going to want to go through and delete the history on everything. I can just select the group and hit Alt-Shift-D, and that's going to delete the history on everything. If you're really worried about it, you can come over here to the channel box and then just select everything and take a look at it. So now you can see I'm starting to have these separate pieces, right? And let's go ahead and we'll refine the leg a little bit more. So again, Shift, right click in object mode, go to the multi-cut tool, and then I'm going to start kind of carving around this shape and make it conform to what I'm seeing a bit better, like this. Hit enter for that, and then I'll just drag this thing out. And let's see here. Let's pull this thing across, and then now I can start to remove this. I'll hit F11 for my faces, backspace, backspace, and get rid of that like this. The next part is we've got this thing separated out. Now we need to start kind of building this thing in a way to where it could actually deform a little bit better. So I'm going to put a point here, and maybe a point in through here, maybe a point here, and then here, and hit enter. And then I'm going to start building out this geometry, something like this. And there's no perfect formula for this. It's just trying to look at the mesh and try to understand how this thing maybe is going to be bending whenever you go to animate it. So I'm going to do something like that. Right here, I'm hitting Y for the last tool that I have. And I can click and drag a point here and then just drag across like that, and you can see it auto-fills the rest of this for me, and I'm probably going to want a little bit more detail in there. And I'm just thinking I might need a little bit more for a bend here, and I think that should be good. Now the other part is triangulating the mesh, because you can see if you right click on here and say vertex and select this, and we'll put on the move tool, tap W for this, and I move this thing around, you can see this kind of popping thing that goes on with the line right there. That's because behind the scenes Maya is actually splitting this face that you see into two triangles, and sometimes depending on how it needs to draw this, it kind of flips that way that it's drawing that triangle, and it causes the geometry to, or the texture to kind of pop around there like that. So I'm going to hit F8 and go into object mode. Again, delete history, Alt Shift D, that's your friend. Let's get rid of all that stuff there. And then we need to find the triangulation thing on here. So it's under mesh and then go to triangulate, and you can see that it's going to triangulate the mesh for us. Now if we keep history on this thing, you can see it's built up over here, and it's still, I believe we're still going to have that problem that we have. So if we select this and we move it around, maybe we won't have that problem. Okay, that's good, but I like to just be really sure about this, so I'm going to hit F8 and delete history again. Alt Shift D is going to delete history, or you can go edit, delete by type history, like that. And then now we have a mesh that is frozen, and it's got the triangulation that we need and everything else. So this whole character was built that way. The other thing I think I need to let you know is about pivot points and kind of moving this geometry around and everything else like that. So there's different ways that we can move a pivot point. We can hit insert, and then we can move this thing like this and position it wherever we want it to be, and then hit insert again to end that tool, and you can see now we can move it about that point. We can also rotate it about that point, so that's its new pivot. So that's one way of doing it. We can put it back on the move tool. If you just hold down D, you can temporarily move things like this, and if you hold, I'm still holding D, I'm going to add V to it, and I could click on this thing and I can actually snap to a vertice. So if you wanted to snap to a vertice in a particular place, you could do that. So again, it's just hold down D and it temporarily turns on that thing for moving the pivot point. If you want to snap to points, add V to it, and then you can kind of move that thing around, and when you're done, just let go, and everything's kind of set. All right? So that was the process for going through all these different pieces, building everything up that I needed. I'm going to go ahead and hide this real quick and put everything back to its original place that we have here. So I'm just going to go and take the rig and these things here. Just take this and zero this thing out like this, and my feet are going to be crazy. And let's just put this thing at 0 as well to get my controls back. So we'll get into this at a little later time, but you can see a rig was made for it, so that's why everything's kind of moving the way that it did. So I'll hide that rig again, and I'll select the geometry that we've got. I guess I actually kept these in individual pieces, so you could keep them individual pieces, that's fine. You know, I just position these things and move them all into place. So you can see the individual pivot points for these things. It doesn't necessarily matter where the pivot point is for these pieces of geometry, because eventually when we build a skeleton, that's going to override everything that you see for that there. So eventually, once we get that skeleton in, these joints become the new pivot points for these pieces of geometry. And this piece of geometry is then weighted to that bone, and then when we have animation and the bones move, it causes these pieces of geometry to go ahead and follow along with it. Okay, I'm going to go put this on the right camera. I think I just had the wrong camera selected, so then that way we can kind of look at this thing stationary. So I'll deselect that. And so this is going to be our next step, building the skeleton out for this thing and looking at how we can kind of weight this thing up. I'll put this on 0 right here like this and just let it play. But that's basically what you're going to do to get yourself the geometry set up with the correct kind of depth. I guess there's some other things just to be, talking about is I think it makes sense to you, and especially if you look at it this way here, you're just going to want to make sure you give yourself enough space in between these things to where the computer can kind of know that this thing needs to draw in front of this thing and this needs to draw in front of here. So you can see even with this type of spacing in between everything, we can still move the camera around quite a bit before it really starts to fall apart. And I think we're about here, and still even somewhat works right here like this. It does kind of fall apart for the eyes and things like that. But the cool thing is about that kind of setup is you're able to kind of do some more dynamic things with the camera, and then the character does feel if it does have this dimensionality to it, even though it's flat, So I think it's kind of a cool look, and I'm kind of excited about, seeing what the final thing really looks like in full motion and inside the game engine and everything. But that's how to get the geometry set up for this portion here.